Jens Stoltenberg, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you so much.
Would you agree that the presidency of Donald Trump brings an unprecedented amount of uncertainty into global security policy?
NATO is an alliance of 28 democracies, and in democracies people elect different leaders with different ideas, different perspectives, and NATO has been able to handle that for almost 70 years.
You have 28 members, you have one dominant member, that is the United States of America. The United States of America now has a president who just a few days ago declared NATO obsolete.
NATO is the most successful alliance in history because we have been able to adapt to change. For 40 years we did collective defense in Europe, deterring Russia. Then we adapted after the end of the Cold War, and we projected stability beyond our borders, ending conflicts in the Balkans, Kosovo, Bosnia, fighting terrorism in Afghanistan. And now we are adapting again, responding to a more assertive Russia in the east.
So how do you adapt to a US president who believes NATO to be obsolete?
What I will tell him, and actually I've already told him, is that NATO is changing because the world is changing. And when I spoke to him, he was very committed to NATO and he expressed a strong support to NATO. So I actually look forward to work with him in continuing to adapt to NATO, because I don't see any contradiction between saying that NATO is important, but at the same time saying that NATO has to change, NATO has to
Sure, but I understand, but let's engage with what he's actually said. To the Times newspaper just a few days ago, he said that in his view, NATO had become obsolete. I'm just wondering how you reacted to that.
Well, I will continue to tell the story about NATO, an alliance which has proven for almost 70 years able to change when the world is changing.
I
and
understand.
Then I will sit down with him and discuss concrete measures, concrete issues where we can do more, where we can change more. And then I agree with President Trump that NATO has to modernize. That's exactly what we have started to do. And we are doing that by addressing issues like defense spending and terrorism, the two main issues he has mentioned.
We'll get to the nitty-gritty of defense spending, fighting terror, and strategy on that front later. But let's first talk values. Would you accept that NATO only works if the member states of NATO share fundamental values about human rights, about freedom, and about security?
NATO is based on some core values: democracy, the rule of law, individual liberties, and of course the strength.
And human rights.
And human rights. As in our treaty we mention democracy, individual liberties and the rule of law, but of course that also reflects the need to protect human rights.
Do you believe there's a place for torture in a security policy?
No, I'm opposed to torture, and torture is against international law, and all NATO missions and operations activities are conducted in accordance with international law. So NATO is against torture.
So when Donald Trump says that he absolutely believes that waterboarding, for example, works, how do you respond to that?
I've seen his statements, but I've also seen that there is a debate going on in the United States, and I also saw that President Trump stated clearly that he would consult with Secretary Mattis, the Defense Secretary, and with the CIA Director, Pompeo, and they have both expressed strong resistance, so they are against torture.
In your view, was he right or wrong when he said that waterboarding works? He said that other people in his security establishment have told him that torture works. Was he right or wrong?
I'm against torture.
But I'm asking you about Donald Trump. He's now the President of the United States. He's the leader of the most important member of your organization.
And I express my opinion, and I express the opinion of NATO, and I tell you what NATO what we do in our operations and missions.
So how damaging is it for NATO, which is a 28-strong alliance which purports to represent key values? How damaging is it when Donald Trump makes, it seems, a case for torture, particularly waterboarding?
It has happened before that there are discussions between allies and within different allies.
How damaging is it,
But
Secretary
the
General?
important thing is what we decide and the conclusions that we draw. And President Trump made it clear that he would not make any decisions about waterboarding or torture before he had consulted, and he mentioned especially the Secretary of Defense and the CIA director. They have expressed that they are against waterboarding and torture. NATO is against torture, and we don't use. Also, all our operations are conducted in line with international law, and torture is against international law. That's my position, and I will of course convey that position very clearly.
Let's talk about some other values, and I'm wondering again how you respond to things that the new United States President has said. Donald Trump has said that with regard to the American invasion of Iraq, we should have taken all the oil. It was a terrible mistake for the United States not to commandeer the oil fields and take that resource from Iraq. He's also said that in the past that he will consider recognizing the Russian annexation of Crimea. Are these values that you believe represent NATO's values?
To accept, for instance, the annexation of Crimea will be against NATO values and clear NATO decisions. And again, we have seen many times before that especially in election campaigns, but also after election campaigns, there may be different views, different positions. The important thing is that NATO again and again have been able to reach a consensus, to make decisions together.
What you seem to be saying is that you desperately hope that many of the clear statements Donald Trump has made about global security policy are not what he's going to do, because if they are what he is going to do, you have got a grave problem.
We are still in early days, and I think the important thing is now that we sit down, all the NATO leaders, and that we consult, that we discuss also the issues where we have different views and different perspectives, and then once again prove that we are able to reach common conclusions and make joint decisions.
I may be misreading you, but in your answers to me, I sense a certain degree of apprehension, worry about what Donald Trump is bringing to the table.
Well, I am actually very confident that President Trump and the new administration, they are strongly committed to the transatlantic bond, because they see that a strong NATO is not only good for Europe, but it's also good for the United States. 2 world wars and the Cold War have taught us that stability in Europe is also important for the United States. And they know that the only time that NATO has invoked Article 5, our defense clause, was after an attack on the United States. And hundreds of thousands of European soldiers, including many from the United Kingdom, have been stationed and have been fighting in Afghanistan in a military operation that was a direct response to an attack on the United States. So in the United States, they know that NATO is important also for them.
Let's talk about a sort of strategic vision. I'm sure you have seen Theresa May's words in the United States just a short time ago, where she said, she's talking about, US-UK relationship, we will no longer undertake foreign military interventions to remake countries in our own image. Now that to me sounds like a major strategic rethink, a strategic shift. Would you agree?
Yes, and it is also in line with the thinking in NATO, because NATO has, of course, has to remain able to conduct big combat operations out of our own area, like we have done in Afghanistan or in the Balkans.
But her words are precisely saying no longer will we undertake the sorts of foreign interventions like Afghanistan, like Iraq. That is the history. That is not going to be what we do in the future.
Well, there is a big difference between Afghanistan and Iraq. Afghanistan had a clear UN mandate and was a NATO operation.
Yeah, but with respect, she says, hang on. She says, we will no longer remake countries in our own image. Right now, today, as we speak, you and NATO are spending billions of dollars with hundreds of personnel continuing to be in Afghanistan to, I think as you put it, train, advise and assist the Afghan military in resolute support mission.
Yes.
What on earth are you doing there if
No,
you're not
but-
trying to remake Afghanistan in the image of Western values?
But first of all, the UK is very committed to our presence in Afghanistan, and I have spoken with Prime Minister Theresa May, and she and I, we have very much the same approach to how we can strengthen NATO in projecting stability beyond our borders without deploying NATO troops in big combat operations, but deploying NATO troops to train, assist and advise local forces to build local capacity.
Are you not, to use her phrase, trying to remake Afghanistan in our own Western image? Isn't that what the Afghan operation was about?
But the character of NATO's presence in Afghanistan has completely changed from a combat operation to a train, assist and advise, meaning that we are there now to enable the Afghans themselves to fight terrorism, to stabilize their own country. And I really believe that in the long run, the best weapon we have against terrorism is to train local forces. And I know that the UK is absolutely behind that idea of fighting terrorism, not only by deploying our own forces, but more by enabling local forces to fight terrorism themselves. And this is the message she conveys, and I absolutely agree with her.
A general point. Did you see just a few days ago that the doomsday clock, which is supervised by a very reputable bunch of scientists, actually the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists actually does this thing, it's an indication of how close they believe us to be to possible nuclear conflict. They put that clock forward to 2.5 minutes to midnight because they said they had considered Donald Trump's election comments, they considered his comments on nuclear weapons in particular, they considered the global security situation and Trump's comments on climate change as well. All in all, they said we are closer to doomsday. Do you agree?
No, I don't agree. And first of all, we don't see any imminent threat for a large-scale war or an imminent threat against any NATO allies. Second, the main reason why NATO is strong is that we are then able to prevent the conflict. The reason to have a strong collective defense in NATO is not to provoke a conflict, it's not to destabilize, but it's to do exactly the opposite.
I understand that.
Yeah.
I understand what you want NATO to be doing. I'm just asking you time and again to consider the impact of Donald Trump. You can't wish him away. He is here. This is what the former NATO ambassador from the United States, Ivo Dolder, said just the other day. He said, we are now entering an upside-down world. Donald Trump is more critical of NATO, the EU and Germany, all close allies, than he is and has ever been of Putin and Russia. That's an upside-down world.
Well, what we see is, first of all, clear statements from President Trump, but also from his security team that they will remain committed to NATO. But this is not...
Well, you're ignoring all of the other comments from Trump.
But in addition to that, we see that words are followed by deeds. They are actually now deploying forces, new US forces, to Europe, more than they have done in many, many years. We will have a new US brigade. We will have
Those
more
were all decisions taken under Barack Obama.
But it has strong bipartisan support from both the Republicans and the Democrats, and they have promised to continue to follow up on, for instance, increased US presence in Europe.
I promised you that we would talk specifics about some of Donald Trump's particular grievances with NATO. One, of course, is very much about finance. He says that we are getting ripped off by every other country in NATO. He says unless countries front up and pay the required 2% of GDP on their military spending, the United States will consider walking away from the NATO alliance. Right now, only 5 countries meet that 2% threshold. That means NATO is in grave danger, doesn't it?
Well, what we have seen is that European NATO allies have started to increase defense spending.
Do you know how much Germany is going to be spending in the next financial year on its military as a proportion of GDP?
It's 1.2 or something.
1.2%.
Yeah, that's true. But
that's almost 50% below what Donald Trump says they have to spend if he's not to consider walking out of NATO.
I agree with President Trump that European NATO allies have to spend more. That's the reason why increased defense spending and more investments in defense has been my main message since I took over.
So what's your message to Chancellor Merkel then?
is that Germany has to spend more, and the good news is that they have now decided to increase defense spending, and they have started to increase defense spending. And for the first time in many, many years, we saw in 2015 that the cuts stopped. And 2016, we will see a real increase in defense spending. It's too early to say whether this is a real new trend. The progress we have seen is still fragile.
Exactly, because frankly, there have been these words for years and years. I've been coming to NATO and hearing Secretary Generals tell me that, oh yes, we're going to get to the 2% threshold any time now. For the last 10 years, and that hasn't happened. I mean,
well, it has started to happen. It has started to happen now.
But now it's an existential crisis, because if it doesn't happen now, Donald Trump is quite clear that the United States will not keep paying for other people's bills.
But the big difference is that for many years we had decreased, the tensions went down, and then also defense spending went down after the end of the Cold War. Now tensions are increasing again, and we have to prove that we are able to increase defense spending. So NATO leaders made a decision in September 2014 to stop the cuts, to gradually increase defending, and to aim at 2% of GDP for defense within a decade.
How worried are you by the Russian threat to NATO's eastern flank right now?
We see a more assertive Russia. We have seen a significant military build-up, but we don't see any imminent threat. NATO has responded. That's the reason why we, for the first time, have troops in the eastern part of the alliance. We have increased the readiness of our forces so we can reinforce rapidly if needed. We do more exercises. We respond also in cyber and other domains. But we don't seek confrontation with Russia. We don't want a new Cold War. So we combine strength and a firm approach with open channels for dialogue with Russia to try to keep tensions down.
Right. Donald Trump has described Vladimir Putin as smart, has talked about his admiration for him, and said, I start off inclined to trust both Putin and Merkel, but let's see how long that lasts. It may not last long at all, i.e. there's an equivalence in his view of Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin. How do you feel about that? Do you see Putin as smart, admirable?
I have met Putin many times, and I've been able to do deals with Russia as Norwegian Prime Minister. And I think one of the lessons I learned from being a Norwegian politician is that it's possible to have a pragmatic relationship with Russia. It's possible to be a neighbor to Russia as long as you are strong, as long as you are firm, as long as you are predictable. And that's exactly what Norway has been able to be, not despite of NATO, but because of NATO. So I believe this dual-track approach, strong, predictable, but at the same time open channels for political communication, for dialogue, to try to find ways to reduce tensions. Russia is there to stay. Russia is not going to disappear. Russia is
the question is whether NATO is really offering a deterrent to Russia. I mean, a study by the RAND Corporation recently said Russia could overrun Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania in 3 days. What kind of deterrent are you really offering?
I think that 70 years of NATO has proven that we provide.
But you keep talking about the past. I'm talking about the present and the future.
But we have proven in almost 70 years that we are able to provide a credible deterrent.
Estonia's Prime Minister doesn't believe that. He has demanded that NATO troops be permanently stationed in his country. Are you prepared to accede to that request?
Well, we are now deploying 4 battalions, including one of them to Estonia, led by the United Kingdom. That will be presence.
But that's a few hundred troops.
Well, it's around 1,000 troops, but you know...
But you know how many troops the Russians can call upon, who can be in the Baltic states in no time at all? Hundreds of thousands.
But the thing is that by having a multinational presence in the Baltic countries, we send a very clear signal that an attack on one of the Baltic countries will trigger the response from the whole alliance. On top of increased military presence, we have established new high readiness forces, which can be deployed very quickly if needed to reinforce. So this is part of a chain of different elements which all add to much higher readiness and increased collective defense, the biggest reinforcement of collective defense since the end of the Cold War.
Cybersecurity, not least because of allegations about Russian interference in the US election. There is a big focus on cybersecurity now in Germany too, where Angela Merkel has said she believes the Russians have been interfering in German politics. Is NATO in any sense prepared for the systemic, organized cybersecurity attacks that may come from countries hostile to the Western alliance in the future?
Yes, we are, because we have invested a lot. We have strengthened our cyber defenses a lot over the past couple of years, because we have seen that the cyber threats really poses a new challenge for the NATO alliance and for all of our member countries.
Do you buy the US intelligence assessment that Russia, authorized from the very top, according to US intelligence chiefs, Russia has been responsible for systemic hacking in the United States, in Germany as well, of the politics of those countries? Because if you do believe that, then presumably right now your mindset is to view Russia on various different fronts as the enemy.
So I trust the reports we have seen from many national intelligence services, including from Germany, United States and others, that Russia is behind many of the cyber attacks. And we have seen the same pattern against, for instance, NATO's own cyber networks. And that's the reason why we are stepping up. For instance, we have decided to establish cyber as a domain, a military operational domain, alongside air, land and sea.
So these, in a sense, are hostile acts from the Russian state against your member states, and indeed against NATO's organization itself.
Yes, and we have seen the same. We have seen the same pattern. We saw it also in 2007. We saw a very big attack against Estonia. That was one of the reasons why we started to strengthen our own cyber defenses.
Which brings me back to where we began, and Donald Trump. Donald Trump admires Putin, says Putin is smart, says that working closely with Putin would be an asset to the United States. I come back to Ivo Dalda's point. This is the world turned upside down.
But at the same time, President Trump has expressed strong support to the transatlantic partnership, to a strong NATO, and I look forward to sit down and work with him on how we can continue to strengthen and to adapt and change NATO to a changing security environment.
And a final point, which is more a philosophical point. Donald Trump is quite plain in his approach. It is all about America first. He is, and I don't think he would mind me saying it, a nationalist politician. We've seen nationalism on the rise in many different countries. One could certainly say Vladimir Putin is a nationalist politician. In this global context, rising nationalism, the emergence of nationalist leaders who put their countries first, what role is there for a collective, cooperative organization like NATO?
Strong NATO is in the interest of the United States. It is in the interest of the United States to have stability and peace in Europe. And we have seen that for the United States it is a great advantage to have friends and allies. So I will tell all the Americans I meet that you have to make sure that you see the value of having so close and good friends and allies as you have in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in NATO.
And if they don't?
I'm certain that they will, partly because they have expressed strong support to NATO, partly because they have learned the lessons from two world wars and the Cold War, that NATO is important also for the security of North America, and partly because they are now increasing their presence, the US presence, with troops, with equipment, with pre-positioned supplies in Europe to make sure that the transatlantic bond remains strong.
Jens Stoltenberg, thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you.